Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening and welcome to INX Prime's special coverage on the G20 Summit South Africa, Johannesburg 2025. My name is Mohammed Choonara and I'll be your host for the next few days as we discuss the events leading up to and the events surrounding the G20 Summit. So earlier this week at the B20 that was held in Sandton, there was a very important event that took place. It was hosted by Okaf SA and sponsored by Standard Bank, which was the Islamic Finance 20. And to speak more about this event this evening, I'm delighted to be joined by Hafiz Ameen Hassen, who is the head of Standard Bank Shari'ah Banking. Ameen, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to INX Prime.
Salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And to the viewers, Mohammed, thanks for having us.
Always a pleasure having you here with us, Ameen. This is a very momentous time for South Africa, being the first African host of the G20. We know many leaders will be here in the country this weekend. I think 16 out of the 20 leaders of highly powerful countries will be in South Africa. Earlier this week, we were at the B20 and Standard Bank, were the sponsors of a really important event, which was the Islamic Finance. Why is it so important for Islamic finance to be discussed?
Mohammed, considering that it's the first African country that's hosted the G20 event, and obviously many of our viewers and yourself, you'll be familiar with the fact that whenever a host nation whenever a nation is playing host to the G20, there are always ancillary events to the core G20 itself and side events that take place. And many of these events serve as voices of those pockets of individuals or cohorts of individuals. And these policy documents, white papers, opinions, or voices of potentially marginalized or voices of the common man are then put forward via these side events or ancillary programs leading up to the G20. And eventually what happens is the G20 then consolidates all of these voices, white papers, opinions, and it becomes quite an important and integral part of policy formation for these G20 nations. And historically, we've seen quite a lot of policy formation come through from the likes of B20 and other like earlier on in the year, they had IF20, the Interfaith 20, where they converged all the religious leaders. Within the G20 and the B20, we see that there's a very strong focus on Africa. Being an African nation, we need to ensure as South Africa, we enable the growth of our African brothers and sisters. And infrastructure development, economic growth in general, featuring quite highly, and many data points suggest that we're entering into what's being dubbed the African century. And the core theme around the Islamic Finance 20 was, we know that there are bucket loads of cash available in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, predominantly with Sharia mandates. The Islamic finance industry is tipping onto about $6 trillion US. The surplus available cash ready to be deployed is somewhere between 300 and 400 billion US dollars. And so the idea that's been put forward for years now is, how do you take the surplus liquidity pool and plug it into the much needed infrastructure and fiscal deficits for African nations, many of which have Muslim majority populations or very meaningful Muslim populations in their countries. So today was a gathering of some of the leading minds of Islamic finance in South Africa, and we were grateful to have some very important figures in the Islamic finance industry globally from Indonesia. We had the ambassador of Turkey. We were also graced by Kas Kuvadia, who's the B20 Sherpa, and we're thankful to the B20 for allowing us a breakout session and a side session to the B20. And the panel was moderated by ex-Minister Ibrahim Patel. So I think it's the inaugural event for us just to play into the G20 nations, to say, look, as governments are looking to fund infrastructure, as governments are looking to fund fiscal deficits, consider this as an alternate liquidity pool. And let's put in place some of the key regulations, infrastructure, and tools for governments, quasi-sovereigns, and state-owned enterprises, and even corporates to access this pool of liquidity.
You mentioned very high amounts, 6 trillion between 200 and 300 billion which is available. We know Africa needs the money.
Yeah.
We've seen rural development has been put on hold in so many African countries, South Africa included. We've seen infrastructure that needs to be built. We're pretty much fortunate in our country where our urban areas are quite well built up. We do have the infrastructure. But how will this enable other African countries to come into Islamic finance instead of dealing maybe with the World Bank or the IMF, which are interest-bearing loans, to get this through to governments knowing that it's a different model of working, which is Sharia compliant. But when you mention Sharia compliant, I think it's a Muslim loan and it's only for Muslims. How do we marry the two, getting people to understand that it's just a purer way of banking?
Look, there's definitely some success stories on the continent. From a Standard Bank perspective, we can speak on some of the transactions that we were involved in. If you take Nigeria as an example, very large Muslim population, nearly 50% of the country, very active Islamic finance market. And if you look at what the federal government of Nigeria, as well as the states of Nigeria, specifically Lagos State and Abuja State, since 2021, they've been successfully active in the debt capital markets, specifically with sukuk. And almost all of the sukuk that they've issued out into the market was in local currency for road infrastructure in the country. And they've been very successful in this. And much of the road networks that have been built in Lagos State, Abuja State, and across the federal territory of Nigeria over the past 6 years have been funded by sukuk. If you take South Africa as an example, in 2023, we were successful with National Treasury. We were joint arrangers on that transaction. South Africa raised 20 billion rand, and that went into the fiscal program that aided much needed infrastructure and other growth expenditure in the country. Uganda is currently in market looking to develop a sukuk program. The Islamic Development Bank already funded around a good few $1 billion into the continent already. So I think the sovereigns in Africa are starting to see that this is an alternate liquidity pool. There's definitely success stories. If you go north of the Sahara, much more success stories in the likes of Egypt. Tanzania also issued sukuk as well. So I think that notion that this thing is only for Muslims has slowly been eradicated. Obviously, it's been a lot of work from the practitioners to try and eradicate those misnomers, but I think we're there. And I think governments are definitely looking at this as an alternate liquidity pool.
You mentioned the word many times in your last answer, sukuk.
Yeah.
For the benefit of our viewers out there, what is sukuk?
Sukuk is an Arabic plural. So in its form, it's a plural form of the word sak. Sak comes from the word in Arabic which loosely translates to certificate. So it's a structure in Islamic finance which loosely translates itself as a bond. So those of us who may be familiar with finance and capital markets, when a government, let's put it this way, Mohammed, when a government wants to, let's start from the start, when a human being, if you earn 10,000 rand a month as an example, but your expenses are 12,000 rand, because now you need to renovate your house or buy a dishwasher or you want to buy a microwave, what do you do as a human being? The general thing that human beings across the world would do is they'll go and borrow the 2,000 rand to go and buy the microwave. So think of that same thing at a government level or a big multinational level. A government earns income from its taxes and other fees and revenues and levies that they charge, and this goes into their income. They use that to pay government salaries, fund the police force, fund the army, fund the healthcare system, and also build roads and all of the key governmental infrastructure. If the government doesn't have enough money for either their spending or they don't have enough money for the infrastructure that they require, what do? They need to go and borrow the money. Similarly, like any other normal human being. So the government goes into the market and they borrow money. How do they borrow money? They borrow money through this instrument that is called a bond. Essentially, it's a promissory note to the investor to say, look, you're lending this government money. The government is going to use it for whatever their purposes are. They'll give you a return, they'll pay you interest, and they'll give you your capital back. Generally, investors say that this is the least risk financial instrument because it's backed by a government. So the government can just go print more money and pay the bond. And I think that's where the Sharia instruments are now starting to take the fore in the global capital markets, is because it's a Sharia compliant version of a bond, but it doesn't involve any interest. It doesn't take into account that the government can print money, and it's actually risk-based. It's either asset-based or asset-backed. The return is linked to an actual asset. If you look at some of the core requirements that are coming through from IOFI, which is our global governance standard setter, and we've seen this very clearly in the Nigeria issuances, the Sharia boards that are certifying these instruments want to see use of proceeds. So you can't just go out and say, give me money and I'll pay you a return. The Sharia boards want to see what is the asset, what's the use of proceeds, and they want to see the tangible asset at the end of the structure. So I think it's a very, very unique instrument. It's been gaining lots of traction globally. And really, we believe that in the century that we're entering into as the African century, we really sincerely believe that it's a great tool to help African sovereigns fund their infrastructure needs.
You mentioned something so important again, the African century. We know Africa is on the global rise. We know that in the next couple of years, we're going to see Africa's population grow from 1.5 billion to 2.5 billion, if I'm not mistaken. But we do know the infrastructure is sorely lacking, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's so important that government bonds can be used. But I want to take you back a bit there when we speak about Islamic finance and why is it so important? We know Islamic finance has been going for the last more than 1400 years. And there's so much wisdom in it from the prophetic teachings from the Quran, speaking about the harms of interest. And we have so many lessons from the life of the Prophet. We saw the Baytul Mal, we saw how well waqfs worked. How important is it for us to put Islamic finance out there, to make it more mainstream?
Look, Mohammed, there's a few key things that we can touch on. We can touch on this from a religious perspective, and we can touch on this from a pure academic perspective. One of the key things that we know from a Sharia perspective is that interest is forbidden, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wages war on those that are involved in interest. And so as a default position, any Muslim who holds the rulings of the Quran dear to them will naturally gravitate towards this particular instrument, because we have to eradicate interest in the transaction. And so therein, with a religious worldview, and specifically an Islamic religious worldview, the core belief is that if you're following the beliefs of or the rules of God Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then naturally within that there will be blessings and there will be barakah. So from a religious worldview, I think that's a default, and that's a given for anybody that ascribes to the faith of Islam. From an academic perspective, and if you take some of the core fundamentals from finance and economics, what you see is many people call out the 2008 financial crisis as a core trigger point in the reshaping of finance in the world, because from there came Basel, from there came King IV, from there came so many different things, because it was this big, humongous global trigger event in the world of finance. And what we saw in that, just using that as an anchor to the academic discussion, is Sharia products were actually quite well bolstered and quite immune to the 2008 financial crisis, predominantly because there's a real transaction. If you look at the normal finance transactions that take place, much of the world runs on what is known as a derivative, where it's actually not a true transaction at the end of it. It's a derivative. It's you're trying to derive money from thin air, if I were to be blunt, right? And that's what happened in the 2008 financial crisis. A series of derivatives, series of calls on the credit stuff, and then a series of defaults that eventually took place, and people didn't have enough recourse to eventually get back to where it was. But the Sharia products were well buffered because you had an actual asset in that at the end of that transaction that people had recourse to. So I think there's lots of academic data that shows it's a more reliable system because you're dealing with actual assets rather than just money being made on money. I think that's a very important thing. There is room to improve. So there's been a very big discussion that has been in flight. And I think it's an important piece for us to acknowledge. The transactions are compliant. All of the boards have agreed that they are compliant. But we need to do much more to fulfill the higher objectives of the Sharia. Some of the higher objectives of the Sharia, which we know as the maqasid al-Sharia, may not be fully realized just yet. And I think it's important for our viewers to appreciate the fact that we operate in a monetary system that is not compliant. Up to the late 1970s, when gold was the monetary system of the world, much of the Islamic world were just transacted because gold was the system. And so interest wasn't that much of an issue because it was clearly defined. In a world where gold is not the money or the monetary system, and fiat currency is the monetary system, it becomes increasingly more difficult to operate and for us to create Sharia compliant transactions because now interest is pervasive. And I think that's where we as the practitioners need to now get to the next delta. The next delta will be fulfilling the broader objectives of the Sharia, like economic justice, equitable distribution of wealth, eradicating poverty, all of these things. We've managed to, almost in a knee-jerk fashion, get compliant transactions out so that people can transact in a Sharia compliant way. The next goal would now to achieve the broader objectives of the Sharia.
Inshallah, may Allah make it easy for us, because I think it's once again so important that we eradicate poverty. We empower people as per the Quranic commands and as per the prophetic traditions of empowering people and making sure everybody, there's no poverty.
Yeah.
And I think without having interest in an environment, we'll eradicate a lot of that, because interest is such an evil that if our creator is declaring war
Yeah.
by somebody using interest, we should realize how dangerous it is. And there's always wisdom in the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Absolutely.
I mean, Jazakallah so much for your time. As always, I think it's really, really important points that you've made. Before I let you go, we know the G20 summit takes place. As a South African, a proudly South African,
Yeah.
what are you looking forward to? Some kind of positive outcome for Africa and for South Africa in particular?
Mohammed, if I were to be a little bit philosophical, you know, we spoke about this in our session earlier on at the Islamic Finance 20 as well. Ibn Khaldun writes in his Muqaddimah, he has this theory of asabiyya. And what an asabiyya is that it is this band of people that have very strong cohesiveness amongst them. But they are such a small band, they operate at the peripheries of the empire. And he speaks about the rise and falls of empires. And he basically says that when the incumbent empire reaches its peak, it then enters into a state of lax, and eventually it starts to deteriorate. And as a consequence of its deterioration, this asabiyya that operates at the peripheries sees that as a opportunity to place itself in this period of lax, and then it rises into the next empire. It's clear that the economic paradigm of the world is shifting. It's clear that the power dynamic of the world is shifting. And African countries, in my opinion, and Islamic finance are the asabiyas of the world today. We've been operating at the peripheries, we've been marginalized, we've been kept on the sidelines. But more and more people have started to see the power within the African continent and the merit of an alternate economic and finance system like Islamic finance. So for me, what I would love to see come out of the G20 is if our voice could be heard by the African nations and other G20 nations as well, to say, look at this alternate liquidity pool, but also to give Africa the encouragement, give Africa the positive energy they need, and give them all of the tools that they need, coming out from its colonial past, where this continent was plundered, literally plundered. We need to give them that reinforcement to say, we're not going to plunder you, we're here to help you, and we're going to let you grow. And in my heart, I sincerely believe that if we do it right and we give Africa the tools that they need to grow, we'll become the most powerful continent on earth.
I mean, Jazakallah so much, and I think such beautiful words, and quoting the great philosopher Ibn Khaldun just is the perfect way to end tonight's program. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah Muhammad. Salam wa rahmatullah.
Walaikum salam. To our viewers, that was Ameen Hassen, the head of Standard Bank Shari'ah Banking. I think really important points made throughout the show, and I think the best way to end it is the famous song that we heard in 2010, It's Time for Africa. From all of us in the team, Assalamu alaikum, good evening.